There is a line in the CIA's own internal review of the Bay of Pigs that says more than any history book could. The operation, the agency's inspector general wrote, was about as covert as walking nude across Times Square without attracting attention. That is not a critic talking. That is the Central Intelligence Agency in a classified document describing its own most famous failure. And the reason that line matters is that it points at the real story here. The Bay of Pigs is usually told as a military defeat. It was something stranger and more instructive than that. It was an operation that was killed by the very secrecy it was built around. A plan whose entire design was to be deniable, and whose deniability is exactly what doomed it. We can tell this story in the government's own words now, because the documents that prove it were locked away for 50 years and only pried loose, piece by piece, under the Freedom of Information Act. So let us walk through what actually happened, and then look at what the agency told itself, in private, about why it went wrong. It begins before John Kennedy was president. In March of 1960, Dwight Eisenhower approved a program to remove Fidel Castro, who had taken power in Cuba and was steering it toward the Soviet Union. The idea was not an outright American invasion. It was something quieter. The CIA would train a force of Cuban exiles, men who had fled Castro's revolution, and put them ashore to spark a counter-revolution. The Cubans would do the fighting. The United States would supply the weapons, the training, and the planning, and would keep its own hand carefully hidden. When Kennedy won the election and walked into the Oval Office, this plan was already moving. It was handed to him like an inheritance, mostly built, with the machinery already turning, and he chose to let it go forward. The force became known as Brigade 2506. There were roughly 1,400 men in it, organized into 5 infantry battalions and a battalion of paratroopers, trained in secret camps in Guatemala. Even the name was a small act of deception. The brigade numbered its soldiers starting not at 1, but at 2,500, so that anyone who learned of it would imagine a far larger army. The number, 2506, came from the serial number of a recruit who died during training. From the very beginning, the operation was dressed up to look like something it was not. That instinct, to disguise, to inflate, to hide, ran through every part of the plan, and it would prove fatal. Here's the central problem, the one the whole operation was built to solve and never could. The United States wanted Castro gone, but it did not want its fingerprints on the body. If American planes and American ships were seen attacking Cuba, the Soviets would have a propaganda victory, and the new president would look like an aggressor on the world stage. So everything had to be deniable. The planes had to look Cuban, the men had to be Cuban, the landing had to happen somewhere remote where it could be passed off as a homegrown uprising. The requirement was not just secrecy in the ordinary sense. It was that the United States had to be able to stand up in front of the world and swear it had nothing to do with any of it. You can see that instinct at work in a single decision historians keep returning to. The CIA's original plan did not target the Bay of Pigs at all. It called for a landing near the town of Trinidad on Cuba's southern coast, a place with a real population that might rally to the cause and, just as important, with an escape route into the nearby Escambray Mountains if the landing failed. If the worst happened, the men could melt into the hills and fight on as guerrillas. But Kennedy and his advisors judged the Trinidad plan too loud, too obviously an act of war, too hard to deny. So they sent the planners back to find somewhere quieter. The CIA moved the whole operation to the Bay of Pigs, a thinly populated swamp with no town to rise up and no mountains to retreat into. The new site was better for deniability and worse for almost everything else. It is the entire operation in miniature, a choice made to protect the secret at the direct expense of the men who would have to live or die by it. And that requirement collided immediately with reality, because the secret was not a secret. This is the part that almost defies belief. Before a single boat reached the beach, American newspapers had already printed the story. The New York Times ran a piece in March of 1961 predicting an American-backed invasion of Cuba in the coming weeks. In early April, weeks before the landing, the Times published another article, headlined that anti-Castro units were training to fight at bases in Florida and Central America, and noting that invasion plans were in their final stages. The operation that the government planned to deny was being described in the nation's most prominent newspaper. Castro's intelligence service read American newspapers. He knew an attack was coming. He did not know the exact day or the exact beach, but the element of surprise, The thing the whole gamble depended on was already gone. This is what the Inspector General meant. You cannot mount an invasion from American soil, train it openly enough that reporters find it, and still pretend it is not yours. But the plan went forward anyway, and it hinged on air power. The single most important task before any soldier set foot on the sand was to destroy Castro's small air force on the ground. If Castro kept even a handful of working planes, those planes could attack the slow, vulnerable supply ships bringing ammunition and men to the beach. So the plan called for waves of airstrikes by the Exile Brigade's own pilots, flying old World War II-era B-26 bombers. And to keep up the fiction, those American-supplied bombers were painted to look like the planes of Castro's own Air Force, so the world would believe they were flown by defectors rising up against him from inside. The first strike came on the 15th of April, 2 days before the landing, and it failed to do the one thing it had to do. The bombers hit some targets, but missed many others, and most of Castro's Air Force survived. Worse, the cover story began to come apart almost at once. One of the B-26s, part of the deception, landed in Miami, and its pilot claimed to be a defecting Cuban airman. At the United Nations, the American ambassador, Adlai Stevenson, stood up and repeated this story in good faith. He held up photographs of the planes and insisted the United States had nothing to do with the attacks, that these were Castro's own defectors. He had been lied to by his own government. And then the cover unraveled in the most humiliating way possible. Reporters looking closely at the photographs noticed that the plane's nose was made of metal. The noses on Castro's real B-26s were plastic. The detail gave it away. The defector story was a fabrication, and now the whole world could see it. The American ambassador had been sent to the UN to tell a lie, and the lie had been caught. This is the moment everything turned, and it turned on the question of deniability. With the cover blown, with Stevenson humiliated and the American hand increasingly visible, President Kennedy faced a choice about the next round of airstrikes, the ones scheduled for the dawn of the invasion itself. These were the strikes meant to finish off Castro's surviving planes. And late on the 16th of April, the night before the landing, Kennedy canceled them. He canceled the D-Day airstrikes because another wave of bombing would make American involvement even more obvious, and he was desperate to preserve what was left of deniability. Political survival on the world stage outweighed the military need. Inside the government, people understood instantly what this meant. According to the CIA's own records, that night, in a meeting in the Secretary of State's office, the Deputy Director of the CIA, General Cabell, spelled it out plainly. Without the dawn strikes, without knocking out those remaining airfields, the brigade's ships would probably be lost, and resupplying the men on the beach would become impossible. The warning was on the record, it was heard, and the strikes stayed canceled. The men sailing toward the beach that night did not know that the air cover their survival depended on had just been taken away from them, to protect a secret that had already escaped. What followed was not really a battle, it was a trap closing. On the morning of the 17th of April, Brigade 2506 came ashore at the Bay of Pigs, a swampy stretch of Cuba's southern coast. The site had been chosen, like everything else, for deniability, a remote place where a quiet night landing might pass for a local uprising. But remote cut both ways. It left the brigade more than 80 miles from the mountains they were supposed to retreat into if things went wrong. And things went wrong immediately. Castro's surviving aircraft, the ones the canceled strike was meant to destroy, did exactly what General Cabell had predicted. They attacked the supply ships. They sank vessels carrying ammunition and communications gear and the reserves the brigade needed. With their supplies at the bottom of the sea and the skies controlled by Castro's planes, the 1,400 men on the beach were on their own. In the last hours, as the brigade collapsed, the desperation finally broke through the wall of deniability. The American crews who had trained the exiles pleaded to fly cover for them, and a few missions went up. 4 American airmen, members of the Alabama Air National Guard flying as CIA contractors, were shot down and killed over the beachhead. Their deaths were exactly the kind of American fingerprint the entire operation had been built to avoid. And so, for years afterward, the government would not publicly acknowledge how those men had died. Even the American dead were filed under deniability, their families left without the truth, because the truth pointed back to Washington, and the uprising never came. The entire premise of the operation was that the landing would inspire the Cuban people to rise up against Castro. They did not. Castro was not the fragile dictator the planners had imagined. He had real support. He had just consolidated power, and within hours of the landing, he had rounded up suspected dissidents across the island and moved his army toward the beach. The brigade fought hard. They were outnumbered, surrounded, and running out of ammunition with no way to get more. Within roughly 3 days, it was over. Something like 114 of the exiles were killed. Nearly 1,200 were captured. Those prisoners became their own long, sad chapter. They were held in Cuba for some 20 months while the United States, deeply embarrassed, negotiated for their return. Attorney General Robert Kennedy personally pressed American drug companies and food manufacturers to contribute. In the end, Castro accepted a ransom of around $53 million in baby food and medicine. The first freed prisoners came home just before Christmas of 1962. Days later, at the Orange Bowl in Miami, the survivors of Brigade 2506 presented their flag to President Kennedy. It was a quiet, painful coda to an operation that had promised to topple a government and instead delivered a few hundred dead, 1,000 prisoners, and a national humiliation. The reckoning inside Washington was severe. Kennedy convened a board of inquiry led by General Maxwell Taylor to dissect what had gone wrong, and its findings moved at the highest levels of government. Heads rolled at the CIA. The director, Allen Dulles, one of the most powerful spy masters in American history, was eased out. So was Richard Bissell, the brilliant officer who had championed the operation and driven it forward. And Kennedy himself, in private, was said to have fumed that he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. In public, he was more disciplined. He took responsibility and gave the line that has trailed the disaster ever since. Victory, he said, has 100 fathers, but defeat is an orphan. It was a graceful way to absorb the blame, but it also quietly buried the more specific truth the documents would one day tell. This defeat was not an orphan at all. It had very identifiable parents, and several of them had warned, in writing, that the child would not survive. Now here is where this becomes a sources and methods story rather than just a history lesson. Because the most damning account of the Bay of Pigs was not written by Castro or by Kennedy's critics or by journalists. It was written by the CIA itself, about itself, and then hidden for decades. In the years after the disaster, the agency's chief historian, Jack Pfeiffer, wrote a 5-volume internal history of the operation. It was thorough, it was critical, and it was buried. And separately, in the immediate aftermath, the CIA's own Inspector General wrote a survey of what had gone wrong, the document with that unforgettable line about walking nude across Times Square. Both of these were the agency talking to itself, with no public watching, trying to understand its own catastrophe. And both were kept secret far longer than the events could possibly justify. The fight to get them out is part of the story. The Inspector General's survey did not become public until 1998. Several volumes of the Pfeiffer history came out in 2011, again only after the National Security Archive sued under the Freedom of Information Act. And the final volume, the 5th, the one dealing with the CIA's internal investigation of itself, the agency fought hardest to keep. It argued in court for years that this volume was only a draft, and that releasing it would, in the agency's own words, confuse the public. It took until October of 2016, more than 55 years after the invasion, for that last volume to be forced into the open. Ask yourself, what is in a document that an intelligence agency fights for half a century to keep buried, long after every operational secret in it has gone cold? The answer, when you read what has been released, is not really secrets, it is judgment. These internal histories do not flatter the agency. They record that senior people had grave doubts. The clandestine service chief, Richard Helms, a man who would later run the entire CIA, wanted nothing to do with the operation and called it harebrained. The Inspector General concluded the plan was fundamentally unsound and that the obsession with secrecy had crippled it from the start. The document spread the blame to the White House, to the State Department, to the agency's own leadership. What they describe, in the government's own handwriting, is not a brave plan undone by bad luck. It is a plan that serious people inside the building knew was likely to fail, pushed forward anyway, and then dressed in a secrecy that made failure almost certain. And that is the lesson worth carrying out of this. The Bay of Pigs is remembered as the moment a young president learned a hard lesson about trusting the experts. But the deeper pattern is about deniability itself. The United States wanted to act and to be able to deny it had acted, and that single contradiction shaped every fatal decision. It chose a force that had to look Cuban, so it could not provide the American firepower the mission actually needed. It chose a remote beach for concealment and trapped its own men 80 miles from safety. It canceled the airstrikes that could have saved the brigade in order to protect a secret that the New York Times had already printed. At every fork in the road, the demand to stay hidden won out over the demand to succeed. The men on the beach paid for that choice. It is the same instinct, the reach for deniability, that this channel keeps finding at the bottom of these files. The need to act in the dark, and then to be able to say, if anyone asks, that nothing happened at all. The Bay of Pigs is what that instinct looks like when it fails completely, in public, with the cost measured in lives. And the proof is not a rumor or a leak, it is the CIA's own history of itself, which it hid for 50 years, and which you can now read in full. The blacked out fear of confusing the public turned out to be the fear of being understood. Read it yourself in the links below. The next file is already on the table.